Good morning, everybody. I'm going to give a talk called On the Meta-Ethical Commitments of Conceptual Engineering. The thesis of this talk is that I think that a theory of conceptual engineering that is successful is going to require that conceptual engineering is committed to substantive normativity within our meta-semantic theory, not just within our first order theory or anything like that. There has to be substantive normativity within our meta-semantics. So the plan for the talk is I'm going to do all this very quickly, but to first go through some challenges, two challenges, and a datum for making sense of conceptual engineering that theorists of conceptual engineering need to address. Then I'm going to talk about two families of views of conceptual engineering and why they fail to meet one or the other of the challenges. And then I'm going to propose my alternative, which I call normative metasemantics. All right, so let's start with the challenges. So these will be hopefully familiar to people who've thought about conceptual engineering a bit. So I'll go through them relatively quickly. So first, there's what's called Strawson's challenge. And this comes from P.F. Strawson. He was actually he was arguing against Carnap's conception of conceptual explication. And Strawson says, typical philosophical problems about the concepts used in non-scientific discourse cannot be solved by laying down the rules of exact and fruitful concepts in science. To do this last is not to solve the typical philosophical problem, but to change the subject. So if conceptual engineering involves a change of subject, then the worry is that we haven't actually addressed our deep philosophical worries. We've just answered a different question or different questions which are easier to answer by changing the meaning of the terms in the questions. Then there's the externalist or what I call meta-semantic challenge. This is the idea that conceptual engineering can't work, it can't make sense because it presupposes that we can engineer our concepts, that the concept of our concepts is somehow in our control. But there's, on most independently plausible metasemantic theories, this just isn't so. The facts about the content of our concepts are fixed by, historical patterns of usage or our causal relations to features in the world. Even on internalist views, it's not clearly going to be up to us what the content of our concepts are. Now, both of these challenges need to be met along with compatible with a further datum about conceptual engineering, which is that conceptual engineering is very normatively diverse. This is a point that I think hasn't been, I think it's been noticed by others, but hasn't been emphasized enough by those working on the theory of conceptual engineering, which is that conceptual engineers appear to be doing three different kinds of things or be engaged in three different kinds of criticisms of normative standards of our concepts. So first, there's criticisms of the conception of our concept. As Sarah Sawyer calls it, our conception of our concept is our kind of meta beliefs about the extension and nature of the concept. So for example, the discovery that, or the purported discovery that race is not a biological kind, but a social kind, doesn't change our extension of race judgments, or not radically at least, but it does change our conception of what the concept of race is about. Then there's the change in the content of the concept, so changing the meaning as well as the extension, such as in the case of marriage. And third, there are criticisms and proposed changes even in the function of a concept. So you might think that the very function of a concept is normatively defective, such as, for example, the concept of mental illness, according to the anti-psychiatry movement, says that the concept of mental illness, its very function is to other people who are not affectively or neurologically typical in certain ways. So these are all, whatever we might think of these particular examples, these are all ways that conceptual engineers appear to engage in conceptual engineering and apply normative standards. And so a proper theory of conceptual engineering should be able to explain all three of these kinds of normative criticisms. Okay, so there are many theories of conceptual engineering, but I want to divide them into two different camps. First, there's these are my terms, what I'm calling ameliorative pragmatism. And ameliorative pragmatism says basically that conceptual engineering is a matter of applying our own pragmatic interests to our conceptual frameworks. And we're deciding between concepts and conceptual frameworks and conceptions based purely on our own interests and interests that are shared between conceptual engineers or broader scientific theorists or broader social theorists, depending on what the particular concept in question is. On the other hand, there are ameliorative realists, and ameliorative realists say that actually there is an objective standard according to which our concepts are improved. This is a view that I think is assumed or presupposed in a lot of conceptual engineers theorizing, but I think is most explicitly and in depth defended by Sarah Sawyer in a forthcoming article, where she develops some things that Haslinger says in her book, Resisting Reality. So what Sawyer says is that conceptual engineering is actually nothing other than a special kind of conceptual analysis, according to which we discover further things about the objective patterns in the world. And these discoveries about the objective patterns in the world, along with the fact that our theories aim to explain certain features of the world, allow for what looks like conceptual engineering, or is conceptual engineering, according to Sawyer, which involves us gaining and discovering a new understanding of the concept and its theoretical role. So for example, Sawyer talks about our discovery that race is not a biological kind, but is a social kind, and says that's not a matter of conceptual engineering per se. It's not a matter of explicitly normative theorizing in the sense of ethics playing a role in fixing our concepts, but rather we wanted to explain as theorists patterns of oppression and discrimination, and we find that race concepts do a good job of providing some of those explanations, and so we've discovered that race is actually a social concept rather than a biological concept. All right, now I think that both of these theories have advantages and disadvantages, but ultimately they both families of views fail. I'm going to focus on the problems for lack of time, but in my handout here I have some of the advantages of the views as well. Okay, so let's start with ameliorative pragmatism. Why is ameliorative pragmatism going to fail as a theory of conceptual engineering? Well, it's not going to fail because of Strawson's challenge. I don't think, or it might, but it's complicated. And they can also easily explain normative diversity. But the problem is that pragmatists, the ameliorative pragmatist view will not be able to easily fit in with any plausible metasemantic theory, either externalist or internalist. So pragmatists want or need for their theory of conceptual engineering that the content of our concepts, the conception of our concepts, and the function of our concepts is completely up to us and interest relative. But there's just no independently motivated metasemantic theory that can capture this fact. And so it seems like pragmatists are only going to be able to capture their theory by basically rejecting or being incompatible with another discipline in philosophy of metasemantics and the motivations for those metasemantic theories. Okay, I think they have other problems too. I'm not going to talk about these. Let me just move on to realists. So I think someone like Sarah Sawyer or the ameliorative realist generally doesn't have the same problems that the pragmatist does, because they have these kind of objective metrics that serve to pin down the content of our concepts. But it looks like ameliorative realists have a problem because they fail to explain the normative diversity datum point. So if we think about Sawyer's story about race, it looks like it shows us that because of the very nature of the realism, they're not going to be able to explain the criticism and revision of the function of the concept. So if it turns out that the function of a concept is inherently normatively defective, the ameliorative realist can say nothing about what to do about that. They have no way to revise the function of a concept, because the function of a concept is not something that is changeable according to the realist. Only the conception of the concept is. So if a function of a concept like woman is, as it turns out, as a matter of descriptive fact, to reinforce biological essentialism or biological determinism or some other misogynistic social practices, then it would entail that, according to the ameliorative realist, Haslinger's project fails, not because she is wrong that her theory of womanhood is an improved definition, but because it involves a normative change that's incompatible with ameliorative realism. And so if you're going to be an ameliorative realist of this sort, it looks like you're going to be committed to a very limited conception of what conceptual engineering can and cannot do. That's incompatible with how actual conceptual engineers seem to practice conceptual engineering. So how do we get around these problems? Well, I think the answer here is to provide a tweak on how the ameliorative realist is thinking of things to capture something important that the ameliorative pragmatist can capture. So here's the rough idea, and then I'm going to talk and focus on mainly one of two ways to fill the rough idea, and I'll mention the other one. So the rough idea here is that concepts play a certain role, certain functional role within our cognitive, social, political lives. And generally, use of a concept within our cognitive, social, political lives underdetermines not just the content of the concept, but also the function of the concept. And so when the function and or the content of a concept is underdetermined by use across a community, reference in these cases is determined, is fixed, alongside other metasemantic considerations, whatever your favorite metasemantic theory is. It also adds substantive normative considerations. So in short here, the slogan is that substantive normative considerations can also help to fix and precisify the referent of a concept objectively, not as a matter of interest relativity. So I think there are really two ways to fill out the rough idea. I happen to favor one, but I think both of these are compatible with capturing the relevant data points. So first is the view that I'm calling normative reference magnets. And this is really just a variation on traditional reference magnet theory in metasemantics. So Lewis's idea, which he took from Merrill, is that when the standard reference conditions for some concept C underdetermine the referent, there are going to be certain properties in the world that magnetize reference to them. Traditionally, for reference magnets theory, or for reference magnetists, such as Lewis and more recently Ted Sider, the properties that are reference magnetic are going to be the properties that are, maybe more natural, or they're the more fundamental properties, or they're the joint covering properties, or they're the essence properties. The details here are not important to us, but the idea here is that there are going to be certain properties which by their very nature are going to attract concepts to refer to them when a concept is otherwise underdetermined in its reference. Now, I think that there's a variation on this theory which can explain conceptual engineering and is also kind of also can capture the positive features of traditional reference magnets theory, which is that we can consider the features that make reference, that magnetize reference to certain properties as not being about fundamentality or joint coveringness, but the properties that magnetize reference are those that would be objectively best to refer to. And we can cash out objectively best here. There's some hand waving here to be sure, but the idea here is this objective best here could incorporate a wide range of normative features. Different theorists might disagree about exactly which normative features, but it could capture explanatory features, pragmatic features, political features, even moral features could play a role in fixing the reference of underdetermined concepts and functions of concepts. There's also another version of this theory, which is that what I'm calling normative descriptivism, which is the view that speakers have a standing background intention that their concepts refer to the objectively best referent, whether or not they're currently correct about what is objectively best. So descriptivism here has a slight advantage initially because it doesn't involve worldly normative relations fixing the reference in the way that reference magnets do or would on the normative reference magnets approach. I think normative descriptivism is going to have problems that traditional descriptivist theories have, as pointed out, for example, by Putnam, but I'm not going to deal with that here. So for the purposes of this presentation, I'm happy with either of these approaches. So now let's turn back to the challenges, and to finish up, let me say a bit about why I think these theories, this idea of normative reference magnets or normative descriptivism, normative realism, broadly speaking, ameliorative normative realism, can explain and meet the challenges as well as the normative diversity point. Okay, so going back to the challenges here, we have Strawson's challenge. Now, according to the normative metasemantic theory, Strawson challenge is going to be met because there is no change of subject. So the idea is that always when a concept has its reference underdetermined, the normative considerations have always been playing a role in fixing the referent onto one property or another. So even when we discover that a function of a concept is normatively defective in some way, that just as Sawyer says about conceptions, that's a discovery that's made that shows us what our concept referred to all along. So if it turns out that a better normative role for the concept of woman to play is one that's not misogynistic, as it seems likely, then that's what woman has referred to all along, even when the concept of woman was first coined. It's also going to meet the externalist metasemantic challenge because it is just really a version. The normative reference magnets theory is a version of externalism. It's going to be you can fold that in with your favorite metasemantic theory in any other respect. It's just an added condition, or it could be just an added condition on metasemantic theory to help precisify reference when it's underdetermined. So it will meet the challenge. And it will also capture the normative diversity point, because given that reference, both the concept, the content, the conception, and the function can all be underdetermined by patterns of usage throughout a linguistic or conceptual community, a conceptual framework, the normative features that help to fix the reference onto something determinate could be any one of these. They could have to do with fixing onto the conception, the content, the function, or all three at the same time. So this idea of normative reference magnets is realist in the sense it needs to be, but also because the normative considerations are also realistically construed, it can also capture the normative diversity. And in fact, I think, and I want to claim, to sum up, that some view like this is really the only way that all three of these challenges are going to be able to be met. So if these are all legitimate points, if we don't want to give up on our ambitions of conceptual engineering, endorse a non-standard metasemantic theory, or change the subject, I think we're going to have to go for some kind of normative or normatively colored metasemantic theory. Okay, thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to questions.